discussing how those kind of sketches that we're creating here can be applied to video game production. What I wanted to talk about is exactly how I create those sketches and where do I start from or where it's going from there. So the first thing I do is I decide to make perspective lines. And I decided to make a 3-point perspective for this particular drawing just to show a scale of the object and make it feel more grand. I'm using a Roman Empire esque Roman Empire ancient Rome classical architecture here. Obviously, when I draw those things, I have a set of references on my second screen, which are not visible here because I want to avoid the clutter. And I'm drawing perspective lines. So I'm only assuming perspectives, and I'm not being super accurate how those perspective lines going to be working. The only accurate perspective lines that are going to be taken care of is the actual vanishing point of the image. Right after that, what I do is I focus on actually drawing itself. The way I want to work with this image and the way I present this image and the way I'm always thinking about when I'm sketching is I want to make sure I have enough space and enough room to actually make corrections if I do something wrong. So I really like to work with layers. I like to keep my perspective lines on a separate layer, so anytime I'm doing something wrong with the sketch, it's not affecting the perspective lines, it's only affecting the sketch itself. And the way I do it, I just start to construct based on the reference I see and how I actually want to construct it and what kind of changes I want to do. I just sketch the lines. One thing I focus on is, and I like to do is, I want to make sure that I'm using not just your regular round brushes. I have a set of brushes that are specifically customized to make them look sort of like traditional pencil or maybe a pen, ball pen or something like that. And I want to make sure that I'm using those brushes because they're adding a little bit of that canvas feel to the actual image, so I don't have to be worried about the overall presentation. This lesson itself is actually providing a set of brushes, the limited set of brushes. So for anyone who's just starting drawing, you should probably limit yourself to those brushes so you don't get overwhelmed with the amount of options you might have, and just sort of choose your own style. The reason to actually do those brushes and work with those brushes is exactly that, choosing your very own style. And finding what works and what kind of brushes will give you what kind of style. So the traditional feel, and that's pretty much the major reason for me to use those custom brushes. So they don't feel very digital. They have a little bit of more of that traditional taste to it. So another thing you notice that I do a lot is I use Control-Z quite a lot. So if my line is not there or it's not working the way I want it, I'll just Control-Z and start over and make sure that those lines are connecting properly. Also, what I like to do is when I'm drawing the lines, I almost ghost the draw. So I would make a movement in the air without touching my pen. I'm working on the Cintiq, so I'm not even touching the Cintiq with my pen. I'm gonna make the sort of like a ghost movement, and then once my hand is in the motion and right motion, I'll make the line. So I know that way I can create a little more accurate lines. Going back to the lesson of how to draw lines and how to make sure that your lines are clean, be sure that you're actually making a fast brush strokes. So next thing I do is, what I like to do is actually work with shadows. What shadows bring to the actual image is the clarity. I'm also adding noise to my background layer, again for that factor, the canvas feel to it. It's sort of like a fake canvas feel to it, but it makes less of a distraction of the digital feel. I like my images to feel a little more painterly natural, especially when I'm sketching. So when I draw shadows, when when I create shadows, the main reason for that is it gives me more clarity onto what I'm sketching. One thing that can happen quite a lot is when you're sketching is you might get lost with the amount of lines you're going to draw, and it's going to be, again, a distraction, and it's just going to cause issues with finding the right rhythm and making sure you complete the image in proper amount of time. The purpose of those sketches is not to spend a lot of time on them. It's to make them really fast, and I've allocated myself to have less than 20 minutes per sketch. I didn't want to go further than that because I wanted to sort of time myself and see how far I can go. So I'm using the lesson, the same lesson I was teaching you about, creating simple shadows. I'm only using one color. I'm not making it 100% opaque. I decided that the motive and the direction of my shadow is going to be vertical, or the lines I'm painting with, painting the shadow with, are going to be as vertical as possible. Obviously, when we have any kind of shelving or stuff like that, where it's absolutely almost a need to have a horizontal lines, I'll do that, but just to keep sort of a consistent style to the drawing itself and make it look like it's being drawn with a precision or more like with a style in mind, I decided to make shadows to be drawn mostly as vertical lines. So, and again, sometimes I'm not going to be happy with the direction and not going to be happy with how far the shadow is going, so I'm going to erase it. But generally, the idea behind this is it's allowing me to find the shape, and you can clearly see as soon as I started adding those shadows to the drawing, instead of just focusing on the lines themselves, I actually made sort of the preliminary sketch as lines and then decided to go straight into shadows. And I'm gonna be combining both as I go, because once the shadows are there, it's much easier for me to decipher what exactly this object is looking like how deep the object is, like how far those columns are reaching, and the material that is sitting on top of the column is sticking out of the wall, how far this material is reaching out. And when you don't have shadows, you need to be more precise with your lines, and your lines need to be more elaborated and more precise and more concise, because otherwise, if you just do the sketch, the sketch itself will be okay, but it's going to be harder to read. The more lines you're gonna put in, the harder it's going to be able to be read like how this object is looking in 3 dimensions, especially when you have 3-point perspective, which is creating a lot of 3-dimensionality and a lot of distortion of the camera. It's not a bad idea to actually use the shadows and draw them on your image. So that's what I do here, and what I'm trying also to do is sort of think about a construction, look at the references, look at the reference that I have at hand and how the columns are looking, and draw those columns and maybe fix some lines, and basically look at the construction and imagine where those lines should be. One thing that is really important when you try to draw, especially when you draw from references and when you draw with lines, is your reference itself is colors and values, and it's not really showing you where the lines are, so you kind of need to imagine where those lines are. And shadows and drawing with shadows will actually help you with that a little bit, because it will allow you to take half of guessing away, because now you already know how the construction looks like, because the shadow itself and the light information that comes from it will give you a better perspective on 3-dimensionality, and without the use of line, you can clearly see what this object is and how it looks. And again, as an aesthetic thing for me, when I draw, I try to use different tricks. So for here, I just added this levels layer, and I played with levels, changed the amount of darkness and brightness, and crush how far the output levels are reaching, just because it feels more as a traditional drawing to me rather than a digital drawing. And it's a matter of putting this drawing into an aesthetic that is comfortable to work with. If you're comfortable with working with a digital aesthetic, that's absolutely fine. You'll eventually can finish the image and make it however you want it to look at the end. But I like to, especially with the line drawings like this, I like to have some kind of this traditional feel, and thus the use of custom brushes, adding levels, layers with changing output levels. So I don't have, like, my black color is not exactly black, it's actually very dark gray. My canvas is not fully white. The noise layer that I've created by using the noise filter is actually allowing me to feel like it's canvas, because when you draw on a tablet or when you draw on your Cintiq, it's almost like a glass flat surface, so your hand will not feel the surface itself, and when you follow your pen across that surface, it's not going to feel exactly like a piece of paper. Piece of paper feels very tangible, and there's a friction between your pen and piece of paper, and it feels very natural when you draw because you're used to it. When you do it with Photoshop and you work on Cintiq, it's not really the same experience. It actually feels very different. So wherever I can fake my mind into feeling it more in the traditional sort of way of drawing, that's a good thing, because I get away from that weird disconnection that I have between the pen and the screen by faking my mind with the visuals. So the next thing you can see I'm doing quite a lot is I'm using eraser, which is when you press E, and then going back to the brush. And when I paint, I'm trying to decrease the amount of lines I have. I only want to have the lines that are significant and make sense, that actually add the detail and give you more understanding what is happening in the image. I'm trying to avoid having an obsolete lines that not necessarily giving me any information at all. So I always going to try to remove those, erase them out, and make sure that the only important lines are happening on the screen. So always going to go back and forth with eraser and brush. One more thing that I'm also focusing on is the only details that I want to see on the screen are going to be details that are because of the information from the architecture itself. So again, it's going back to decluttering and removing obsolete lines, and making sure that lines that are not necessarily that are not necessary for understanding what's in the image are not there. I'm always going to be removing them and making sure that they are not affecting the image and are not there for no reason. The biggest advantage of using Photoshop, because when I'm talking a lot about having that traditional feel of drawing, and adding those little tricks to trick my mind. Obviously, when you use Control Z, it's hard to then convince yourself out of that thinking, that this is really digital media. Is one of the biggest differences and advantages of working inside Photoshop, and one of the reasons why actually in video games and in film you're going to be most likely required to work with digital media, is the fact that you can always go back and forth and do Control Z. When you're working on paper, and imagine you're creating lines and you create too many of them, When you work with pencil, it's still manageable. You can erase some of them if you have a really good eraser, really sharp one. The more lines you're gonna make, it's the harder it's going to get. The further you get with your image, it's almost gonna be at some point impossible to do massive changes. If you're using pen, then forget about it. Like as soon as you create your statement, it's there. You cannot fix it. And let's say you're 60-70% with the image, and then you create a couple of bad lines and you're ruining the whole sketch. And I had this happening to me many times when I sketch, and there's a lot of sketches that I do are just failures, and I need to start over and work with them again. But the reason it's great to work with digital media is just that. It's just the fact that it's more forgiving. You can Control Z your way out of pretty much every single problem. Whereas if you would be painting this image, if I would be doing this with traditional media, I would be way more careful where I'm putting my statements, where are my lines. I would probably construct it a little more, or I would make the sketch much more loose. So that's the biggest difference. Almost finished with this sketch. Going in, doing little changes, fixing the shadows, and sort of putting a little more lines and a little more details here and there, making sure that I can make a little more clarity on and read from this sketch. Right now, it already has enough information of three-dimensionality. I always think forward and think like what could be added, but sometimes it's a mistake. So for instance, right now I just decided, okay, I'm gonna make the shadow here, but that might not necessarily be the wisest decision. So as you can see, I'm putting a statement and erasing it. If I would have a pen, this would be just a black block that I would not be able to get rid of because it's impossible to erase a pen. So that's pretty much the first image. So I'm gonna, at the very end, I'm just doing some really cleaning up. I'm also deciding to add a little bit of the detail, like a little bit of sculpture detail on top of that entrance. I'm not necessarily providing any information what kind of sculpture this is. I'm doing really quick, dirty lines. I'm not really caring about how it's gonna look like. It's just an impression of a sculpture. It doesn't really matter if it's really well explained or not. It's just the idea. It's there. And finally, the naming convention. I always want to make sure that my files, or as much as I can, that my files make sense. So I can always find them and access them. Okay, so from here, we're pretty much repeating the exactly same process of sketching, which is starting from perspective lines, going with our vanishing points and our perspective points, and then drawing lines and creating this one value shadow to add a little extra depth to our sketch. So it's pretty much nothing new. It's exactly the same process. And from here, I wanted to focus on the actual gist of the lesson and discuss how this kind of drawing and everything we've learned so far, what kind of application this has in the actual video game studio when you actually work for video games, when you have a project that you're working on, and why it's important to focus on those things. So we've discussed a few major topics here in this lesson 1, and some of those topics are going to be recurring, such as architecture. And let's go briefly through why they're important. So we've discussed architecture, we've discussed foundations such as perspective, and also how to draw this one value shadows, and how helpful this is when you're doing those line drawings and sketches. So the reason, and let's start with the architecture first. The reason why I'm putting a lot of emphasis on using architecture and actually understanding architecture and sort of breaking it down into easiest possible digestible form where you know what the architectural style is. And I again highly recommend to go really deeper into it and get a little bit more understanding of what those architectural styles are and where are they coming from and why they're important and what kind of place in the history they have. The importance of architecture is very it's one of the most important foundation of drawing, I think, because when you're supposed to be an environment concept artist, when you're supposed to work for video games, one thing that is going to be really apparent is the knowledge of how things are done. And the idea behind concept art in general is that whatever you draw, it has to have a function. It's not an illustration where you're trying to convey emotion or a situation. Concept art, the major meaning for concept art is to create function and the ability to then use that function as a blueprint for everyone else who works within the studio. Remember, working for video games, it's not that you're an individual that is creating the game by yourself. So whenever you're hired as a concept artist, the idea is you're working within a team. You're working as a group effort. So your efforts have to help everyone else. Your efforts have to be helpful for your artists or for your level designers, because the idea is that you as a concept artist can visualize what's on paper or what your game designer or game director has in mind by just giving you words and descriptions, and maybe what your art director has in mind by giving you references. So because it's important to have a function in your concepts, the best way to give that functionality to your concept is to understand architecture. And if you're supposed to draw maybe landscapes, then reading a little bit about geology and how those rock formations and maybe how erosion happens, it's also a great thing, because then you're giving this extra layer of believability to your images. Knowing architecture allows you to create a believable constructions that you can quickly relate to. Whether it's a historical piece where it's a must to know how this architecture or what kind of architecture is used, it's almost it's basically a necessary thing to know. But let's say you work for a video game star, maybe fantasy or sci-fi. Knowing architecture can allow you to create design language and forms that will make more sense and will be much easier to read for an average person that maybe is not well versed in artistic world. The meaning of that is basically just because you know architecture, it's allowing you to have that extra layer of foundation and extra layer of understanding how things are built. And once you have that, then you can create your own experiments and draw your own sort of deviation of that architecture. It's very similar to anatomy. When you want to be, let's say, if you want to create caricature and you want to create stylized images and stylized characters, the best way to approach it is actually to know anatomy before you get into stylization. If you stylize your characters without knowing anatomy, it's not going to look as good ever as if you would know anatomy and then use that knowledge to actually form something more interesting out of it and add those extra deformations. But yet they're still going to work because they're coming from the solid foundation. And it's the similar qualities that you need to look into when you're working for video games and when you're supposed to create environments. There's a lot of environments that are going to touch upon architecture, and knowing architecture will get you to that extra sweet spot where you can create much more impressive images just because they have a solid foundation. The second thing we've discussed was the actual foundation, which is, perspective and understanding of perspective. One thing that is really important about it is, obviously, without knowing perspective, it's going to be extremely hard to create anything convincing, whether it's on paper or digital. If you don't know perspective, because we as humans always see in perspective. That's how our eyes work. We can see the distance. We can by just looking at whether it's nature or whether it's a photography or drawing, our brains process the distance and can understand the distance by just looking at scale and how the scale changes depending on how far or how near those objects are to you. So our brains are wired to be almost perfectly understanding perspective. And if you don't know how to draw in perspective, what's going to happen is a viewer's mind will automatically see that something is wrong. Obviously, there's small deviations if the perspective is not super well done. Let's say you're giving yourself a little bit of wiggle room and your perspective line are not perfect. But if they are somewhat within the realm of accurate, then it's good. Then your average brain will process it. Okay, this is looking fine. I understand the scale, I understand the depth, and all that stuff. So for anyone who's beginning, knowing perspective is one of the most important aspects to do. For people that already work as artists for a longer while, there's one thing that happens when you work in the industry for a longer time is because tools are changing so much over time and you get to use more and more tools as you go. For instance, as a concept artist for video game, obviously you're going to be drawing and you're going to be painting, you're going to be photo bashing a lot. So using photography to actually construct your images. But also at some point you're going to get into 3D. So you're going to start using 3D imagery, renders, and stuff like that. And what happens is that knowing how to draw in perspective is almost like a muscle. And if you're not using that muscle, it's just deteriorating. And knowing, like, getting back to the habit of creating your own construction lines and creating construction lines that actually can allow you to construct things in perspective will allow your brain to process the way you draw slightly different than if you wouldn't pay attention to that. Even if you know perspective, because that's a skill that once you master, it stays with you. You might be if you're not using it, if you're not just thinking in constructing in 3D and not using lines to construct those things, obviously it will deteriorate. It will not be as sharp over time, but it's still a knowledge that you already possess, right? It's like driving a car, where once you learn how to drive a car, if you are not driving for a year or two, it's, once you get in the car, it's going to feel really weird, but it's going to be really quick for you to remember what were the steps in order to drive that car. So it's a similar situation here. Your brain will process it, your brain will know what to do, but you maybe not going to be as sharp. But one thing I've noticed, going back to perspective drawings and sort of breaking things down and not relying on photography and not relying on 3D, what is changing in my brain is it's changing the way I process geometry and changing the way I think about objects. I start to see again where those parts of geometry are. Like, I can deconstruct my images and deconstruct photography in order to create extra complexity that otherwise I would not be able to do, or otherwise I wouldn't think about without maybe thinking what kind of other photography I could add to the mix to make it even more complex. So it's kind of like going back to the roots for the extra repetition, and it's like sharpening the rusted blade, or like cleaning the rusted blade to make sure that it's still functional. And that's one of the reasons why I encourage everyone, even those who already have a lot of experience working as a concept artist, to go back to the roots, to go back to the foundation, because it's just so important. Everything sits on the foundation. If your foundation is deteriorating, no matter how many fancy things you're gonna add on top, it might eventually get really rusty and collapse. So going back to foundation is really important, and that's one of the reasons why I'm covering almost in depth in this course, and why it's important for the video games production. Basically, connecting foundation skills such as perspective and with architecture, what it allows you to is you get a solid foundation for what you need to know in order to create environment concepts. Environment concepts are based on perspective skills. Obviously, later on, we'll learn about colors and values and all those things that allow you to elaborate your skills a little more or refresh your skills on those aspects a little more. But the foundation itself, once it's really solid, it's almost like it's allowing you to be unshaken in your decisions. So once you understand perspective really well, and once you refresh perspective drawing and start to see those geometrical shapes in your head when you're working in a different style, and once you get in the habit of construction, it will actually allow you to process the 2D imagery in a different way than if you would just paint and rely on color and light maybe. The construction process, understanding of architecture, and knowing the principles or basic architectural styles and what actually drives them is creating a really good foundation for you to start off and create sketches that will be much more much better to read and much better to understand, and eventually gonna look much better than if you wouldn't have that skills, if you wouldn't have the perspective skills, or if your perspective skills would be deteriorating, or if you wouldn't have any knowledge about architecture. You would be just giving yourself assumptions, mixing things that don't much match to each other, and assuming that this is the right way of creating environment concepts, especially when there's any kinds of building involved. So with those two reasons in mind, foundation is important. And the third aspect to talk about here is the aspect of how those skills can be applied to actually, the video games creation, and how we can apply the sketching methods, just sort of constructing with perspective lines and one singular shadows, and how you can apply this to actually when you work in video games, and when you would apply that. So there's a couple of different tasks that you might be facing when you work within a studio, when you work with game designers, or when you get tasks from your creative director or art director. And one of the most obvious one is obviously coming up with ideas. And what is the easiest way to come up with the ideas? Obviously, sketches and thumbnails. Thumbnails themselves, I personally use thumbnails to not focus on architectural styles or sketches for a specific maybe interiors or exteriors. I rather focus on, when I create thumbnails, I use them mostly for shape languages and finding the right design. However, if I want to have some kind of environment in mind, I rather spend a little extra time and create the actual sketch. So instead of spending a couple of minutes to create really rough thumbnail, I would rather spend anywhere between 15 to 20 minutes and time myself to actually not spend more than that to create sketches that are maybe a little more expressed, maybe a little more fleshed out, and showing a little more of what I have in mind, and maybe add more of the visual description to what is expected of you. So for instance, when I'm creating those sketches for environments here, the information I'm giving back to, let's say, my art director or a game director, is that I'm not only providing them a visual cue for what the style of this environment could look like, but also suggesting lighting, or maybe suggesting the construction or a scale. There's a lot of parts that can be added just by creating those sketches. So obviously scale and style of architecture are the most important. Right here, I'm just drawing architectural styles. I'm not really going further than that. I'm not going into fantasy or sci-fi world by using those styles. That's something we're gonna do a little later, where we'll elaborate those architectural styles into something new once we get a better understanding of how to use them in combination with principles of design. However, knowing architecture here, knowing foundation, and having this skill set of drawing really quick sketches like those will allow you to have quite a few sketches done within a day, and it will be a great starting point for discussion of what this environment could be. If it's a timepiece, if it's a historical game, for instance, then maybe your sketches will not only express the construction that is there, but maybe the amount of destruction that is happening to this construction, for instance. So let's say your brief is create, classical Rome constructions or inner city that is nice and fleshed out, and how this could look right after there was a war or something like that. Then within 20 minutes, you can create 2 different images, and you're already starting a conversation without focusing on putting a lot of more effort into the actual painting. Or if you would decide to go with thumbnails, that might be not enough information to actually have a proper review and move forward. One thing I dislike about thumbnails, and one of the reasons this kind of sketching is much more important for me, is thumbnails are great to start small conversations, talk about design, talk about shape language. However, they are not giving enough information, and they're creating just too many iterations for discussions. Once you have sketch that shows the actual construction that is done in perspective, that touches upon architecture and gives you a better idea of what is actually presented, and you present it in a way because you get to use things you've learned from architectural styles, and obviously from drawing objects in perspective. It's much better fleshed out information for your supervisor to go from there and maybe discuss what could be done next, or what could be changed in the construction of your image, and how this could be applied to further steps. And finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about is timing yourself, and when it's good to time yourself and when it's actually not good to time yourself, because this is going to be quite important. Timing yourself only works if your goal is to increase a speed of thinking and making decisions. When you time yourself, you're forcing your brain to take shortcuts. And when you're taking shortcuts, you're forcing yourself to think and make rapid decisions, with consequences that your rapid decisions might be wrong. So when you time yourself and you practice to fail and make those wrong decisions, what's going to happen is you'll increase your efficiency in making right choices quicker. So instead of thinking about the design of what you have to create for too long, you will actually make more rapid decisions, and your design choices will be more accurate, but maybe not necessarily perfect. If you give yourself more time to think about your design choices and to think about what you actually want to draw, your decision will most likely be more thought out, and that way you will be able to create something that is more convincing. However, it's going to take more time, so you need to find the right balance. If you're asked in video games to create sketches, and your main goal is to create an interesting ideas, then you don't want to time yourself. You obviously don't want to spend the whole day on one sketch, because that's ridiculous. You want to create a couple of sketches during the day, but you want to give yourself a little more extra time, maybe just to think about what you're exactly doing, do some research, work through the references, and look at the references and make sure that you're going in the right direction, you're using the right architectural style and stuff like that. If your goal is to, hey, we have a meeting in 2 hours and we need a couple of sketches because we totally forgot about this, if it's an emergency situation, then having a practice to time yourself and do something with the limited amount of time will actually help you to be sure that anytime this kind of request appears, that something has to be done for yesterday, and preferably give us 10 sketches now. it will allow you to create quick turnarounds without creating too much failure. It's not maybe necessarily going to be the best thing in the world. However, it will do its purpose. It will show some ideas to discuss. Otherwise, there's nothing to discuss and there's nothing to progress from. So timing yourself is tricky. You need to practice both. You need to practice creating images with a time limit. So let's say if you're creating those sketches, you could create sketches that are timed within 15 or 20 minutes. Or you could also do sketches that are maybe 30-35 minutes. You're giving yourself that 10-15 minutes of extra time to do more research, to think about it, to think through the choices of how you draw, and then make a maybe more informed decision. Or maybe just, give yourself a couple of tries and you draw something and then you erase, you change it, you fix it, and then go back to it and redraw. So both techniques are good, but they have different applications. So it's a good idea to use both and work with both. However, don't limit yourself to only one, or don't use one of those techniques to create an impression that might not necessarily be true. For instance, drawing something for an hour and claiming it's done in 10 minutes, because it's going to bite you back. If you're creating something that takes a lot of time and you're claiming that it's not taking a lot of time, you're creating expectations from everyone else on top of your own work. So next time around, when you're going to be doing sketches, and imagine a client sees that and hires you just because they see how efficient you are. If you all of a sudden if it's taking you hours to create that stuff, that's going to be a bad sign, and it might end up with you getting fired. So think about timing as a method of practice, not as a method of impressing people. And that'll be pretty much it for this part of the lesson. We're gonna talk about homework and takeaways next.